Good morning, Mr. Hammond's class. We will continue on Book Scavenger. I used to type a cipher called Siftal. They take a vertical strip of paper like this, and you wrap it around a cylinder-based object. James held up a pencil. He wrapped the strips around it, and all the letters lined up horizontally. To decode my message, you have to wrap the paper around an object with the same diameter as the one the original message sender used in order for the letters to align correctly. This pencil is what I used. Vivian raised her hand and spoke at the same time. Your message still doesn't make sense. You can't use nonsense words and expect us to figure them out. Can you, Mr. Quinsley? Before Mr. Quinsley could reply, Emily spoke up. Those aren't nonsense words, she said, realizing she could read James's message even though nobody else in the class could, and she smiled at what it said. He used a substitution cipher to encrypt his message as a backup, in case you figured out the Siftal right. James nodded, smiling. James held up a piece of paper that showed their secret code. This is the cipher key I used. Decoded, my message reads, Royal Fungus. Jack sat back down. Mr. Quinsley clapped. Emily joined in without even thinking about it. She lowered her hands quickly, embarrassed by her show of enthusiasm, but James gave her a half smile and Steve a good job pat on his tips. Small gestures, but they made Emily feel a million times lighter. When the bell rang and everyone collected their things, James shuffled down the aisle and out the classroom without a glance her way. Emily didn't realize she must have been obviously watching him until Maddie stood up beside her and said, Looks like too little too late. She pumped up her mushroom cap hair with one hand. Maddie was only trying to get under her skin. Emily knew that, and it worked too, but not in the way Maddie might have been hoping for. Hearing her fear verbalized by Maddie, that her friendship with James was over for good, had the unexpected effect of making Emily realize how silly it sounded. It wasn't too late, and oddly enough, Maddie, of all people, had just given Emily a brilliant idea for how to make things right. Back in her apartment that afternoon, Emily wrote a note for the bucket. All it said was, I'm sorry. She placed the note in the sand pail. She picked up the reindeer antlers and tapped a paper towel on them. Arranging the items to look like a white flag, waving for a truce. She stuffed the antlers in the pail, making sure the flag would be visible in James's window once raised. When the bucket had been lifted, she secured the rope to the pail, so the pail would remain there until James retrieved it. A little while later, the ceiling creaked. James's window was opposite his door, so Emily knew he'd seen the antlers and flag when he walked into his room. Whether or not he'd check it was another story. The creaking stopped, then resumed again, and James's window slid open. His snorting laugh and the tinkle of a bell carried down through her open window. He returned a response. I'm sorry, too. Emily sent up a following note. Can we talk? James came over and they spent Friday evening catching up on the week. You had those men trekking all the way to Sunset, and Babbage is Mr. Quinsley? He shook his head in disbelief. I stopped talking to you for a few days, and all sorts of stuff happens. The most exciting thing for me was dinner with my dad at Michelangelo's. Winning a homework pass for Quinsley's challenge is nothing to yawn over. You're one up on Maddie now. You know she's stressing that you'll have to make her hair look like a toadstool. Which reminds me, I have a plan I think you'll like. I'm calling it Operation Royal Fungus. Monday marked 3 days since Emily had deciphered the scarab clue. It still stung to think about the gold bug squeezed onto a shelf somewhere and Mr. Griswold's game going dormant. But it was the words of her brother, of all people, that comforted her. She'd rather have played some of Mr. Griswold's game than none at all, and things had been righted with James, so she hadn't lost everything. On her walk to school, they rehashed the plans for Operation Royal Fungus. It hinged on them maintaining the appearance of their fight, so they parted ways before they reached Booker. At lunchtime, James staked out a table next to Maddie's in the library, his latest code work spread in front of him. When Emily approached, James made a big show of scooping his papers together. "Can I help you?" he said. His anger and annoyance was palpable. Emily forgot for a second that they were pretending. She stammered. Maddie nudged the girl next to her and jutted her chin in Emily's direction, which was exactly the motivation Emily needed to surge forward with the lines she and James had practiced. "What are you working on?" she asked. James didn't look her way. Emily dropped into the seat beside him, their backs to Maddie. "James, come on, are you still mad at me? You won a homework pass now." James gathered his papers and tapped them against the table. "No thanks to you. And Maddie could make a comeback, so I haven't won our bet yet. This new cipher makes my other ones look like a preschooler puzzle. There's no way I'm sharing it with you and risking it being stolen or copied." "Your Baconian cipher would have been broken anyways," Emily said as James held the stack of papers behind him, hovering over his wide-open backpack. "I mean, binary code? Doesn't that seem kind of obvious, especially coming from a computer geek like you?" "What?" The plan was for them to fall onto the floor instead of into the backpack. But for their scheme to be believable, neither one of them could look to make sure that was, in fact, what happened. "Besides, I saw that idea in a book," she continued with her script. "Prove it." James grabbed his backpack without looking at it and followed Emily as she marched across the library and disappeared between rows of bookshelves. When they were out of sight of the tables, Emily whispered, "Did she fall for it?" James bent to a low shelf and slid aside books to create a tiny window. He crouched down and peered between the spines, watching a moment before he held up a triumphant thumb. "I practically dropped the papers at her feet," James said. Of course she couldn't resist. "Well, let's hope she uses them. Then the rest is up to Mr. Quinsley. Hopefully he notices." In social studies, James made a big show of looking for another missing item when Mr. Quinsley collected the cipher challenge submissions. No surprise to Emily or James, Maddie turned in her submission for the challenge. Mr. Quinsley accepted it and looked it over. Slowly he raised his head, his eyes locked onto Maddie's. "Is this a joke, Miss Fernandez?" What Maddie didn't realize was that the cipher wasn't James. The cipher belonged to Babbage, copied word for word. It was a Sherlock Holmes level cipher, and Emily and James didn't have a clue how to solve it. James had included a fake solution among the pages he pretended to drop in the library. They figured either Mr. Quinsley would recognize his own work, or later, when it went unsolved, Maddie would have to reveal her solution, which would prove to be a nonsense answer key when she started walking the class through it. Emily was so pleased with her trick had worked. She almost missed Mr. Quinsley's stare shift momentarily to her. Almost. It was enough to remind Emily of an important detail she'd overlooked. Mr. Quinsley knew she knew his book scavenger identity was Babbage. If he recognized his own cipher from the website, then it was a logical step to connect to her. Emily studied the carved diamond in her desk, but Mr. Quinsley addressed Maddie, not Emily. "I know this cipher, Miss Fernandez, and I know it's not yours, but cheating is not tolerated in this class, on any assignment. Furthermore, you were warned last week about the consequences of turning in a cipher other than your own creation. I'm disqualifying you from the contest." James scribbled on his notebook and raised it for Emily to see. DUS, or yes, in their cipher language. All they'd wanted was to give Maddie a taste of her own medicine. Having her disqualified added an extra bonus. "What?" cried Maddie. "That's not fair." "Disqualified, end of discussion," Mr. Quinsley said. "You've wasted enough of our time." In the hallway after class, Maddie stopped up to Emily and James. "You set me up," she cried so loudly students stopped to stare. "Do you hear that?" James cupped his hand around his ears. "That's the sound of Stevie celebrating my win. Don't worry. You'll look great as a redhead." Maddie blushed. "Your win. I didn't lose. I was disqualified. I don't remember that being part of the bet. Do you remember that being part of the bet, Emily?" "Nope." "The agreement was whoever earned more homework passes or got to 3 first. Disqualification wasn't mentioned. I won, and you have, let me count." "Oh, that's right, none." "Whatever, it's a stupid bet. I wouldn't have made you shave your head." "Right," snorted James. Emily turned on her heel and marched away into the crowd. "You'll start a toadstool trend," James called after her. "Embrace your fate. Don't be afraid of your own destiny." "Do you think she'll do it?" Emily asked. "Not a chance," he said. "It's okay, though. Watching her squirm was better than the toadstool hair. She probably would start a trend, or she'd at least enjoy all the attention." Chapter 35. Sea lions bray carried from Pier 39 as Emily and James walked up to their building after school. The sound took Emily back to her first day in San Francisco, almost a month ago. Hearing wild barks in the middle of the city had been jarring, unexpected, but now they were soothing. It wasn't every day that she could hear them, so she knew the noise was a gift. She knew the city well enough now that she could track a route down their hill and through the grid of streets that stretched below in the general location of Pier 39. They climbed the front steps of their building, which had once looked so starved and severe to Emily. Now it welcomed her like a familiar friend. The contrasting trim above the top windows, like raised eyebrows, surprised to see her again. She invited James over to hang out, and as they walked up her stairwell, her apartment filled with skateboard thunder and Matthew chanting Fish lyrics. "Sorry about that," she said. "Matthew's going to a concert tonight." Emily was interrupted by whooping even louder than Matthew's singing. Her parents burst from the kitchen, racing down the hallway towards them. Her dad held a carton of orange juice overhead, and her mom hollered behind him. Emily and James pressed against the wall to let them run by. "What's going on?" Emily shouted. "It's a celebration," her dad said. "All we had was orange juice, but I don't care. This is the most celebratory orange juice ever." Matthew rolled out of his room and dug his heels into the skateboard to flip it up on his hand. Freshly shaved swirls dotted his skull. "Celebrating me going to the Flush concert? Ah, you couldn't have." "It's sold," their mom clapped her hands. 50 homes in 50 states. Sold. "Our agents just called us with the news." "It's sold," Emily repeated. Her parents passed out plastic cups of juice, but Emily was too shocked to accept one. Everyone but Emily hopped around, orange juice splattering on the floor, and chanting with her parents. "We sold a book! We sold a book!" Even Stevie got into the party with his bobbing back and forth. Her dad swung her ponytail like he was conducting an orchestra. "Come on, Em. This is a great day. Great news." She remained in a firmly non-bouncy state. A feeling something like dread was overtaking her. Emily yanked her ponytail from her dad's hand and marched to her room. The whooping and hopping dulled as her family and James watched her go. Why was she being such a Scrooge? She knew she was ruining the moment for her parents. How hard would it be to hop around and drink some orange juice and pretend she was excited as everyone else? What an idiot she'd been. She sat in her bed, her backpack still on. She let her guard down and gotten herself attached to people and a place when she knew it would be inevitable that they'd move again. Her parents were publishing a book about living in 50 states, for Pete's sake. James pushed open her door. "Are you okay?" he asked. A horn honked repeatedly, and Emily heard her brother yell, "Showtime!" Of course, he was totally unfazed. He leaned into the adventure and all that. No Jack quote could help her now. There was something to be said for stopping to enjoy your surroundings, too, instead of always looking ahead to what came next. She didn't care what was waiting around the next bend. She knew it would be another puzzle-loving computer nut with a cowlick. James shifted from foot to foot. "If now isn't a good time, I can go." Emily grabbed her backpack and stood up. "Now is the only time. Come on." Her parents stood where she let them, leaning together in conversation. "Emily," her mom said, "we know you're not happy about our announcement." Emily thundered past them and down the stairs with James at her heel. She slammed the front door behind her. A station wagon full of Matthew's friends backed into the street, and Emily waved for them to stop. She pulled open the door. "Scoot over," she said to Matthew. "What are you doing? You don't have tickets. Just move." There must have been some "don't mess with me" tone in her voice because Matthew nudged his friend, and they slid over. Emily wedged herself on her brother's lap, and James squeezed in next to the door. "Where are we going?" James whispered. "Mr. Remora. I think I need to finish Mr. Griswold's game, or at least try." "You know where he lives?" "He told Hollister he lives by the Fillmore." She nodded to her brother. That's where we're going. But James plucked at Steve. There's a lot of places to live around the Fillmore. I remember his address. James raised his eyebrows. Well, I remember most of it. It's sevens and ones, like 1177 or 7171. Okay. She could tell James was dubious about her impulsive plan, but she was determined to find Mr. Remora and ask him for the gold bug back, even if she had to knock on every 1-7 combination address around the Fillmore. They circled the neighborhood of the music venue, looking for street parking. With every loop, Emily scanned the street numbers. She knew Mr. Remora lived close enough to complain about the Fillmore, and 1717 was the closest possibility. That had to be it. They finally found parking down a side street and everyone piled out. Emily swung her backpack on and hurried ahead of Matthew's group. James was right beside her. When they got to the Fillmore intersection, Emily and James turned up the street, away from the music venue, running to cross in time before the light changed. Where are you guys going? Matthew called. Emily walked more quickly. She was determined to do this, and stopping and explaining herself to her brother would just slow her down. Matthew left his friends and caught up with them. What's going on? She's going to get a book, James said. You came all this way for a book? Can't it wait? Emily spun on her brother. No, it can't, Matthew. If you had flush tickets and then someone took those precious tickets away and that was your one chance to be part of the flush experience, what would you do? Would you be happy about it? Would you just say, that's cool, no biggie? Or would you at least try to get your tickets back? Matthew stood with his arms crossed, his eyes squinted in concentration, like he was really imagining himself in that scenario. I'd get my tickets back, obviously. Well then, pretend my book is a pair of flush tickets. That's how important this is to me. Emily resumed walking, her backpack slapping against her with the forcefulness of every step. She assumed her brothers would go back to his friends. Instead, she heard him yell, "Hey guys, I'll catch up with you in a minute." Then he jogged past Emily and James and clapped his hands like a football coach. Let's move, people. We've got a book to rescue. Chapter 36. Emily had her doubts, staring up 1717 Fillmore. She expected some shabby and brown, like Mr. Remora's briefcase, but this was a tidy Victorian with a bright purple shop on the ground level and green stairs with prim white banisters leading up to the front door. So this is the home of the book thief? Matthew said as they stood there at the base of the stairs. What do you want me to do? Scale the tree? Break a window? He's not a book thief, Matthew. Emily gripped her backpack straps, looking up at the front door. He's a rare book specialist. She walked up the stairs. What are you doing? What is she doing? Matthew asked James. It looks like she's ringing the doorbell. That's your plan? Matthew said as he and James joined her on the front step. You're going to ring his doorbell and ask him to give you back the book? Before she could second-guess herself, Mr. Remora opened the door. I don't eat cookies, he said, and was about to close the door on them when Matthew stuck his foot in the way and held the door open. Hold on, we're not selling cookies. My sister has something to ask you. Mr. Remora, I'm the student who posted about the gold bug on Book Scavenger. I know Mr. Quinsley gave it back to you, but I was wondering if I could look at it again. I don't know what you're talking about, said Mr. Remora. Don't you remember us? We saw you at Mr. Griswold's office and Hollister's store. Emily added, "We know you're a rare book collector, and we know Mr. Griswold is one of your clients." "Well, good for you," Mr. Remora snapped. "I still don't know what you're talking about." "Perhaps you should check again with your teacher." "Didn't Mr. Quinsley call you? What part of 'I don't know what you're talking about' do you not understand?" James and Matthew looked at Emily, waiting for her direction, but she was stumped. Mr. Quinsley had been adamant that Emily give up the book, that it was returned to Mr. Remora ASAP. "Emily," James asked, "are you okay?" A sickening feeling took over her. She told Mr. Quinsley about the game. He said he didn't want to look at the puzzle because he wouldn't be able to risk solving it. "I need to sit down." Mr. Quinsley never saw the Maltese Falcon cipher, but it would be easy enough for him to open the gold book, find the typos she's marked, and put the pieces together himself. Matthew swung an arm around her side, letting her lean on him. Pushed Mr. Remora's door with his free hand. Mr. Remora pushed back. "What are you doing?" he sputtered. "Can we come in for a second?" Matthew asked. "I don't think my sister feels well." "No, you cannot." Matthew empowered Mr. Remora, and he and Emily tumbled inside. "I'm fine," Emily gasped, although her vision was spinning. There were books piled on every seating option, so she sat on the floor, not bothering to take off her backpack, and put her head between her knees. "Emily," that was James crouching next to her. Raven had hidden 49 more copies of the gold bug of the Maltese Falcon across the city, plenty for Mr. Quinsley to find, and surely he'd solved the pig pen clue in no time. And then it was just a matter of time before he solved the entire game and uncovered the grand prize. "How could I have been so dumb?" she moaned, confiding in Mr. Quinsley of all people. Mr. Quinsley, Babbage, once a poacher, always a poacher. She lifted her head, trying to find something to focus on. The room they were in was half family room, half kitchen. Piles and stacks of towering books were everywhere. Only a sliver of sunlight cracked through the closed drapes, making the room feel dreary. A dark hallway led to the back of the house. "Can she have a glass of water, please?" James asked. Mr. Remora picked up his phone. "Get over here," he snapped into the receiver, "right now." Matthew crossed to the kitchen and opened a cupboard by the sink until he found a glass. Mr. Remora threw his hands in the air. "Make yourselves at home, I guess. I'm sorry to have bothered you. I made a mistake." From somewhere down the hallway, a door squeaked open. Mr. Remora closed the front door and flipped the deadbolt. The clump of the footsteps drew nearer until a tall, lanky man stepped out of the hallway. "Uncle Leon, what's going on?" The man speaking was one of the BART station men, Barry. Emily remembered from when she tricked him into taking Hollister's Poe collection. Barry looked from Matthew in the kitchen to Emily on the floor and James crouched next to her. "What's he doing here?" Emily said at the same time Barry asked, "What are they doing here?" Emily stood. Across the room in the kitchen, under the glare of the pendants, lay the gold bug. "You do have it," she cried. Forgetting everything else, Emily ran and lifted the book from the island. The gold beetle greeted her, shining in the rose-hued light. So Mr. Quinsley hadn't tricked her. But then, "Why did you lie?" She faced Mr. Remora. James and Matthew flanked her on either side. Mr. Remora remained by the front door, his arms crossed and scrolling. "It's none of your business. Why does it interest you at all? I didn't think Edgar Allan Poe was popular with children these days." The doorbell rang. Mr. Remora twisted the deadbolt and tugged the door open. "Took you long enough, Clyde," he snapped. The tall, burly man who had been with Barry the other day stepped inside. "What are they doing here?" Clyde crooked his thumbs in their direction. "Who's the new one with the spiderweb shaved in his head?" "They're squirrels," Matthew said. "I thought you said we were done with the kids." "Well, I was wrong," said Mr. Ramona. "It seems they've come to help us." But the look in his eyes when he stepped towards them made Emily step back. "Let's drop the charade. We are both interested in that book for the same reason. Mr. Griswold's ridiculous game." "You know about the game?" "Of course I do. Not the specifics per se. But he's been babbling about armchair treasure hunts for years, asking me to locate this or that book so he'd have a complete collection." Barry cleared his throat. "Why don't you let these kids go? We can just chalk it up to a mix-up. You finish whatever you're doing with the book, and they can forget any of this happened." "Why should I waste my time on solving Griswold's game when I'm fairly certain this girl has already done so, or is close to completing it at the very least?" To Emily, he said, "That's why you're so desperate to have the book back, isn't it? So let's work together. I'll even let you have the gold bug as a keepsake. You won't be interested in the prize anyways. It's nothing a kid would like. No toys, no candy. You know what the price is? Why else would I go to the trouble? Who wanted to do this for fun? I hate games. What do you say? Care to share your secrets?" If Emily could get the man away from the door, they might be able to make a run for it. The kitchen was in the furthest corner of the room. That's where everyone needed to move to give them the best chance of breaking away. "Well, you're right. We have practically solved it," she said. Her voice shook as she spoke. "But we're stuck on the last clue." Okay, we will stop here and pick it up when you have library again. Have a great Thanksgiving, 5th grade.